you doing? It's good to meet you.
Good to see you.
It's good to see you.
Well, good afternoon and welcome.
Yeah. We'll remind him. That's a very good point.
Thank you all very much for coming. I'm Merit Jano, Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here today. I think, as many of you know, SIPA has launched a new initiative both on internet governance and also on a host of cyber issues, cyber policy issues, in part with support from the Carnegie Corporation. And the goal of our work is to promote research and engagement with leading thought leaders and scholars, and to provide opportunities for our students to learn a great deal more about these issues and also to think of constructive solutions. And so we're pursuing several different initiatives around internet governance, and today's discussion will be a very important window into the issues. Of course, we're very honored to be joined today by Fadi Chehadé, who is President and CEO of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, better known as ICANN. And in the world of internet governance, you know, there are a few organizations, in fact, very few indeed, that are as central as ICANN. And its responsibilities range from the management of the Internet's domain name system to the operation of root name servers and more. But these are critical responsibilities that keep the Internet stable, open, and global. Founded in '98, it's already had a long-standing relationship and is very well known in the world, and had a long-standing relationship with the U.S. Department of Commerce. But that arrangement is scheduled to expire next year. And of course, the U.S. has signaled its intention to transition some of ICANN's responsibilities to what is being called the global multi-stakeholder community. At the same time, the internet governance system is undergoing fast-paced technological changes, and there are many policy proposals that have surfaced, as well as civil society groups coming together to discuss these changes. And now we have a collection of competing views, both over, I would say, technical issues as well as broader policy questions about the governance of the Internet. And it's in that incredibly complicated and multifaceted world that Fadi Chehadé, as president, has to lead the organization. And as head of a multi-stakeholder, consensus-driven organization, I expect you must be an expert in trying to navigate such complicated waters. Let me just say briefly that prior to joining ICANN, Fadi had a very impressive history, founding multiple companies and organizations. In 1999, he founded Viacor, which was a B2B service provider, I understand, acquired by IBM in 2006. He also conceived and led a not-for-profit, Rosetta Net, which brought technology heavyweights together to think about standards for B2B communications. In the 80s, he worked as a systems engineer. Born in Beirut, but no stranger to New York. He earned his bachelor's degree here in computer science and completed a master's in engineering management. So let me just say again how delighted that we are to have you here to share your perspectives at such a crucial time. Please join me in welcoming Fadi Chehadé.
Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you, Dean Jano, for this introduction. I will be brief so we can quickly sit down and engage on the important subjects at hand. Let me just set the scene a little bit. the world right now is looking at the internet as a major resource that is truly a universal resource. It has economic impact that is beyond anyone's imagination. Next year, in the G20 alone, the digital economy will pass $4 trillion. It has an impact on how we socialize. It's an impact how we live. It has an impact on boundaries. And this is a big one. On personal boundaries, legal boundaries, nation-state boundaries. The internet is such a transnational and trans-boundary resource that it's challenging a lot of things. It's brought a lot of good. It also has the propensity to potentially bring harm because of its reach. So how do we balance a permissionless, limitless, borderless resource with a world that needs structure and needs rules? How do we do that? It's complicated. When a minister in a pretty powerful country tells me, listen, I receive 500 court orders a month to shut down websites, and none of the websites are in my country, what do I do? He's challenged. Does he shut some services, some web services? He knows this is fraught with issues. What does he do? His legal system and him do not know how to deal with the internet. When an attorney general of a major country also in Latin America calls me and says, we have a massive attack on our children with pornography sites targeting the children in my country, what do I do? Of course, my answer was shut the sites. He says, I did, but they opened an hour later elsewhere. I said, well, call the Attorney General in that country. He said, I did. And he did shut them, but they opened again elsewhere. What do I do? Challenged. Right? And so policymakers around the world are, frankly, quite challenged right now. And we cannot give them empty answers that simply say, the internet is this wonderful thing, you have to live with the good and bad. That works up to a point. We need to give them some framework so they understand how to operate. And the reason Dean Jenow is right, that we are now at a crossroads where we have two possible frameworks that could emerge, because a framework will emerge. It will emerge. And if you want evidence of that, see, for example, the speech of President Dilma Rousseff to open the UNGA in 2013. A very frustrated head of state. See the reaction of Angela Merkel when allegedly somebody listened to her phone. She didn't know what to do, so her first reaction was, let's create a German internet, which she obviously very quickly realized is not in her interest, or frankly, in the interest of the global community. So these are, our leaders are being challenged, and they will have to pick between two frameworks. Either a framework that is largely the known framework of international cooperation, which is essentially the intergovernmental frameworks that we all know, understand, and can function within. Or are we going to give them an alternative? As one stateswoman actually was telling me recently in a meeting, we need to give them a 21st century framework for governing a 21st century resource. We can't govern the internet with 19th century methods. It's just not going to work. What is that framework? What is the 21st century framework? Well, some of us, you hear us running around using the word multi-stakeholder. What is multi-stakeholder? Well, it means all stakeholders are engaged. Okay, the next question becomes, well, how do they all get engaged? For example, the ITU says they're multi-stakeholder. And in fact, if you look at who attends some of their meetings, not all, yes, there are different stakeholders. But who decides? Who makes a resolution at the end of the day? Well, in the case of the ITU, governments only. So is that multi-stakeholder? Is it sufficiently multi-stakeholder? I don't know. These are the questions we're all asking right now. Another key word that we use when we speak about a 21st century governance model is the word polycentric. Key word. We don't want a governance model that is centralized. We believe that's antithetical to the internet. The internet architecture was designed so no center controls the network. I believe that the governance of that network should resemble its architecture. And that's polycentric, meaning we have a highly distributed model of different players building solutions. And when you have a polycentric model, you need a highly designed map. Otherwise, you can't find your way through the polycentric model. So there are some very complex issues we're facing at the global level. And if we do not give the world clarity on these two frameworks, and frankly, more than clarity, a path to start working in one or the other framework. And by the way, I'm a great proponent that there isn't a single solution. There could be some issues that need the international framework to be solved. There could be others that need a more, with more innovation in governance. Finally, I just want to touch on ICANN. ICANN is one such center in this polycentric model. We're not the ecosystem. We're just one of the many centers. Our job is frankly highly limited. We deal with names and numbers and some protocol parameters. Important? Yes. Administrative in nature? Yes. Technical? Largely, although we're starting to touch on public policy issues. For example, do we hand .Islam to a company in Turkey backed by Iranian investors? Is this proper? Not. That touches on global issues, right? You do not easily make such a decision. Do we give .Amazon to the company that sells us books, or do we give it to the people who have the Amazon in Latin America? I know, that's a good question, and we need to answer these questions. But that's ICANN's role. It sits just there. And our dean here made a very important point, that the US government has come now to an important conclusion, that as we design the macro-level internet governance ecosystem, it is important that the key centers of governance that exist today, such as ICANN, become good reference models. And is ICANN as a reference model successful in promoting multi-stakeholder, polycentric methods of governance when it has a historic contract left over from the early days of the internet? Our belief and the US government's conclusion is the answer to that question is no need for this contract anymore. I will finish on ICANN by saying the following. Some people ask, what happens when the US government leaves? What will be the model? The US government made a very broad statement. They said, when we leave, we want to make sure no government replaces our role at ICANN, or no group of governments, and certainly not the UN. So people ask, so what will replace the US government? And I always give the analogy of helping my two boys ride a bike without the training wheels. So for a while you teach them to go on the bike with the training wheels, and then there is a point where I had to start taking these training wheels off. When I took the training wheels off, I did not put new training wheels, I did not put different training wheels, I removed the training wheels. And ICANN is in the state. ICANN for 16 years has been functioning as a multi-stakeholder global body. When I arrived, it was clear ICANN wasn't global enough, so we worked very hard to make it more global. I divided our headquarters between Singapore, Istanbul, and LA, instead of being very US-centric. We grew our staff around the world. We opened engagement centers everywhere, from Montevideo to Beijing. So we globalized the institution. Now it's global, it's multi-stakeholder, and it's ready. When we remove the US contract, which is our training wheels, we're good to go. Are we perfect? No. Can we improve our accountability? Always. And therefore, we will improve our accountability, we will strengthen ICANN, but ICANN is a model, and it's working, and I invite us all to participate in ensuring that ICANN continues to function in the way the world expects it to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to transition into a discussion, and may I invite two of our experts, Andrew McLaughlin and Gordon Goldstein, to join us. Andrew McLaughlin is a senior fellow at SIPA in Internet Governance and Cybersecurity as part of our Tech and Policy Initiative. He was previously in the White House, in the Deputy Chief Technology Officer, also for years at Google, and early on in the initial years of ICANN, and is, of course, an entrepreneur in the tech space as well with many companies he's driving to success. So thank you, Andrew, for being with us. Gordon Goldstein is very much a friend of ours at SIPA. He is a graduate of Columbia Law School, managing director at Silver Lake, the largest technology private equity company in the world, in charge of government relations, and has been very much involved in internet governance thinking and has written on it in many places. So thank you both for being with us. And and really they're here to join a conversation with you. And I'd like to invite Andrew to get us started.
So Fadi, let me press you on one point in particular. So by way of personal disclosure, I was arguably ICANN's first employee. There's some debate about who got the first paycheck, and I think I may have cashed mine first because I was the poorest at the time. At the time, in 1998, when we got this thing off the ground, it was driven by a crisis, which was John Postel's untimely death. The internet was about 50 million users. We're now up to more than 3 billion, I think, at last count. ICANN has scaled sort of beautifully. I have to say, like the success of ICANN is that nothing has really broken under the organization's watch, and the multi-stakeholder model has sort of scaled up. But let me press you on one point in particular, which is from my kind of amateur's view from afar, one of the things that's troubled me, and that is this: the great question about ICANN as a multi-stakeholder organization rooted in a set of technical resources rather than the collective assembly of national sovereignties, let's say, which is what a treaty organization would base its legitimacy on. ICANN has had to prove that it's not captured by the interests that make money off of it, right? So fundamentally, the fear about ICANN has been that because it's so open-ended, because anybody can show up and take part, that those people that have the greatest economic stake in the decisions will sort of like flood the halls and drive the process. And frankly, the new TLD process has produced a huge spasm of unhappiness in the business community that I'm now a part of, because as far as we see it, it just created a massive pool of phishing opportunities and sort of like trademark problems. We have to spend a bunch more money on TLDs. I generally think that those fears are somewhat overblown, but they are legitimate. Like, I'm going to write a bigger check for domain names than I would have written last year for zero additional value to my users, just an increased cost of doing business. And so when I look at that, it makes me think that, well, a bunch of people are going to make a lot of money. A lot of people are going to get no additional value. It's going to cost more money. Isn't that evidence that the ICANN multi-stakeholder model has not only been prone to capture, but in fact has been captured by the registries and registrars and so forth? So what's your
And you
thought?
might explain what the TLD process is for.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. This is very insightful, actually, because you definitely have watched us get to this point. And I'll answer your question, but just as Gordon said, a TLD, top-level domain, is, for example, .com. That's a top-level domain. And until recently, we had 22 generic top-level domains, as opposed to country top-level domains, like JP for Japan, or FR for France, etc. So in addition to these, we had 22 .com, .org, .edu, you're familiar with them, .museum, etc. The community, over a 7-year effort, decided that we should open that up and allow anyone, essentially, to apply for anything, right? Whatever they want. So I was this morning at the City Hall because New York got .nyc, for example. Or a few weeks ago, I was at the Vatican because they got .catholic in Chinese,
Good.
Arabic, and Latin characters, etc. So that's what the TLD is. I think Andrew asks a very important question. How do you ensure that in a place like ICANN, which has grown significantly both in size as well as in work space, what we do today, how do you make sure you don't have one sector namely businesses, for example, controlling the debate and making sure they're fueling programs, frankly, to line their pockets, essentially, is the question. Right? I would say that there are a number of things we have done to ensure that's not the case. I'll give you an example. When I arrived at ICANN, I asked a simple question. How are we making sure that globally people can engage in our processes? Well, the answer was generally, we're open. Everybody's welcome. Right? It's free. You can join ICANN. There's no membership. I said, well, that's not good enough. We have to actually proactively go out and help, especially those who are not engaged. Let's start with people around the world who are not engaged, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. When I arrived, Asia, which has the majority of internet users in the world now, had one ICANN employee in all of Asia. And I said, how could that be right? This is a massive continent. So now we have 28. And they're all over Asia, engaging with governments, engaging with civil society, engaging with users, bringing them into our fold and adding that value. I took ICANN headquarters and I divided them immediately in 3 so that we have operational leadership in Istanbul and in Singapore serving these time zones during the times they're awake, not when we're awake. So engaging is very important. And that's one way to ensure we flood the holes with everybody. Secondly, increasing our spend on groups that have a harder time showing up because they may not have money. Businesses can show up at any meeting anywhere around the world. But if you're, let's say, a member of a civil society group and you're barely making ends meet, or if you're a member of a poor government that cannot fund you coming to ICANN meetings. So we now have increased by millions our funding for people in need. We fund tens of governments to come. We fund tens of users in civil society to come. We help them be part of the dialogue. And the third and last thing I'll mention because of time, and this is a difficult one, but I want to share this with you, Andrew. I think you'll appreciate it. ICANN is a very different organization. I was sharing with our dean earlier, Dean Jeno, that not many private organizations have 147 governments permanently sitting advising us. This is a very strange thing if you think about it. And we have 30 IGOs constantly there attending our meetings, advising us through structured processing. ICANN is a very different institution. But also it's an institution that has a lot of roots in the contracts and the legal frameworks that we use to govern the industry called the domain name industry. When I arrived, I felt that we need to add to that legal framework a public responsibility framework. So for example, I could easily tell you that when people attack ICANN, as a reporter in a prominent newspaper here in the city attacked us, that we're not stopping illegal pharmacies. This is almost like saying to the New York Limo Commission, you're not stopping bad things happening in limos around New York. Well, I don't know that the Limo Commission can monitor every single thing happening in every limo in New York City. I mean, they'll do their best to make sure the people who have that limo license are, good business people and they're operating properly. But putting ICANN, which provides, if I can use the analogy, a system to get a license plate for a car, responsible for what happens in every car, is kind of not right. So in the past, ICANN would have said, not my issue. I'm just giving the license plates. You go talk to somebody else. But I do think we have a public responsibility to maybe not solve the issue because it's not I have no mechanism or no tool to solve what happens on every website. But I can participate and coordinate with others to make sure we don't just say it's not my issue. All of us once in a while go into a government office and somebody says, sorry, sir, I can't do anything for you. Go to another agency. And you feel helpless. ICANN has a public responsibility role, and I've been adding in that. I just added Alan Grogan to my global leaders. Alan's going to be responsible to ensure we participate in global user advocacy programs and we support issues that are beyond our legal framework. So that's the best we can do, and we're trying hard.
Okay, well, thank you very much. May I invite Gordon Goldstein to offer a comment?
Well, first of all, Fadi, welcome to Columbia. Dean Jano has made a commitment to expand the ambit of SEPA's focus on issues related to internet governance and cybersecurity and all of the related and complex issues. And it's wonderful that you are here today to help us accelerate that process and engage in the thought leadership that these issues require. I'm going to ask you a question wrapped in the form really of a provocation. And it stems from my recent participation on the American delegation to the ITU Plenipotentiary Conference in Busan. For those of you who don't track arcane meetings of the UN, every 4 years, a specialized agency called the International Telecommunications Union at the United Nations convenes a global gathering to define its mandate and its remit for the next 4 years, its priorities. And this year, as anticipated, issues related to the internet and what in the ITU are referred to as ICTs, Information and Communication Technologies, were very high on the agenda. Yeah. At the conclusion of the conference, there were no less than half a dozen major resolutions that touched on different elements of internet governance and internet policy, ranging from questions of access, cybersecurity, consumer protection, and also to the debate and adjudications of complex issues in global public policy. Yeah. And there, notably, the ITU decided that it would create a body within its organization to address these issues, and notably, that it would exclude civil society. And it would exclude the participants who historically have been at the very heart of the multi-stakeholder model. So here's my provocation for you, Fadi. The ITU is engaged in a methodical, progressive, and fairly aggressive exercise to expand its jurisdiction over issues related to the global internet.
Yes.
And they are engaged in a process of mission creep, and it is a threat long-term to the global multi-stakeholder governance of the internet. So respond to that provocation, please.
Spot on. They are trying to expand their remit. We have experienced that in their last meeting in Dubai, which was in 2012. Let me simplify how it happened in Dubai. People would stand up and say, we're in an ITU treaty-making organization. We would like to address this internet governance issue. And we would say, not here. Not here at the ITU. This is not the remit of the ITU. This cannot be an intergovernmental treaty. And we said that once, twice, 3 times, and they keep standing up saying, okay, fine. At the end they said, we understand. You don't want to solve this here. Where do we go? And our answer was, in Dubai, not here. And they said, okay, we got that. Where do we go now? How do we address these issues in a multi-stakeholder way? And so we left the wicket, which was in Dubai in 2012, with the determination that the best way to address, in fact, the quite aggressive stance of many governments that we need to solve these issues is not to keep telling them not here, but rather to coalesce and create an alternative. And that is the alternative I mentioned when I spoke earlier about something new, a 21st century mechanism that would attract governments to it. And we've been working extremely hard to create that alternative. Because if we don't have an alternative, frankly, we'll show up again and say, not here. And if you noticed in Busan, Gordon, you put your finger on it, it wasn't the old-timers that were talking about why the ITU should govern the internet. It was the young, new regulators and legislators and governments starting to stand up and say, who's going to govern how the Internet of Things will work? They started bringing up the new issues that their prior generation of government officials, frankly, were not touching on.
And that was South Korea.
And that was South Korea.
Proposed.
So, and Bahrain and different countries starting to speak about the future of where these things will be governed. Therefore, it is urgent that we answer this young generation of regulators looking for, where do I go? And so last week, ICANN, in cooperation with the Brazilians and with the World Economic Forum, announced such an alternative. It may not be the only alternative, but it is an alternative called Net Mundial. The Net Mundial platform is a place where people can come and start coalescing to answer some of these questions. If we do not energize such things, we're going to end up telling people again, not here. And that's not good enough.
Well, let me ask you one question. I've served as the North American judge on the WTO appellate body and watched, the pressures that have come to the bank and the fund and the WTO and others from civil society to become more open and so on. And but I'm puzzling as to what has to happen, and then what are the longer-term policy questions around which we need to develop some kind of architecture. So there are ICANN transition issues that have to happen.
Yes.
How much of these other enormous questions of governance have to be addressed in order to answer the transition questions?
I think if you take this is an excellent question, by the way. In other words, are there some very specific things that need to happen on the macro level so that the transition can go through in a way?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer to that question in very specific terms is no. However, if we do not start addressing the macro issues, sooner or later, the pressure will mount on ICANN and other existing organizations to essentially hand the keys to an unraveling of how internet governance will happen into, frankly, the ITU or other multilateral bodies that I think will slow down the internet as we know it today, and will close it from where it is today. So it is, these two things have to happen in parallel, but they are on different speed tracks. The ICANN transition is moving. It has a very specific schedule. The community is engaged, and it is our hope that through good participation and hopefully cool heads in DC, we're going to get through that transition in the near future. The global discussion is not rushed, but we cannot go yet to another Busan or to another ITU meeting. UNESCO now raised its flag. They're holding a major meeting in March, saying we need to be part of that too. And frankly, my answer to all these folks is yes, you should all be part of it. We need UNESCO to be part of this. We need the ITU to be part of it. But that's different from saying we're moving all internet governance into a body that is still, no matter what we say, is not multi-stakeholder. I'm not welcome. I'm not a sector member at the ITU. I can show up and make a speech, but I'm not part of this decision-making. So it's important to keep that in mind, that we have to offer that alternative, and if we don't, we have an issue here. But it is not directly related to the transition. It is, in the context of the ecosystem, related, but not directly.
So we will open this up for questions, but let me invite our two experts to offer a further comment before we do so.
Well, so listening to that, I'm struck by something that we should just call out. And this is something that you'll never hear sort of an ICANN person ever raise explicitly. But we should talk about what it is that the geopolitical battle here is about. Because there is a fundamental geopolitical battle that's taking shape around the governance of the internet. On the one side has traditionally been the United States and Europe, and a few allied countries like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and some others that have made it a fundamental component of national policy to protect, one, a single globally united internet that, two, embodies normative values of freedom of speech.
Correct.
And freedom of action on the internet. And those two things have run counter to the interests, the expressed interests of a set of countries that ranges from sort of China on the repressive side to Brazil, Turkey, and Thailand, and other countries on the more democratic side. These are countries that, for a combination of reasons, have resisted the structure embodying that normative value, namely ICANN. And so the geopolitical value battle that's taken shape has united countries that believe in a multipolar approach, which is to say, we like the internet as a platform for free speech and innovation, entrepreneurship, human interconnection, but we really don't like the unipolar monopolization of oversight that has been exercised by the United States government for historical reasons. And it has united their interests with a bunch of governments who simply just want to exercise control. The Chinese being the most notable example, but there are other countries like South Korea that, for their own reasons, believe in a strongly paternalistic national state when it comes to, or France for that matter, that's right. What I like about the structure that we are moving towards is that there was this earlier iteration of the where do I talk about this stuff called the Internet Governance Forum, which was just designed to be kind of like a recurring talk shop hosted by the UN. What you've now done, though, by bringing the Brazilians into the driver's seat, alongside the World Economic Forum and the elite interests that are kind of represented there, is that you've now managed to cleave the repressive states and their interests from the democratic states and their interests. And I use these terms very loosely, but what I generally mean are states which are interested fundamentally in control versus states that are interested fundamentally in multipolar, multi-stakeholder decision-making. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very interested in that. I think it's a smart move. I'm sure someday we'll get to read a book about how that actually came about. But it's a very significant achievement and a big advance over where we were, say, 5 years ago. Yeah. The other thing that I want to say is just this, which is I think that some of that runs into conflict with the answer that you gave me earlier, which is to say, I have long been grumpy about the expansion of ICANN as even a talk shop into adjacent areas, beyond the allocation of names and numbers. I think it's hard enough to figure out what to do with a proposal for .cashman, let's say, which is the kind of thing people fight wars over and handle it badly. Or .islam, right? I mean, there are any number of arbitrary strings that have deeply embedded geopolitical, religious, cultural, ethnic significance that cause conflict, in this example. Yes. And so I recognize the strategy, which is to have staff participate, not to arrogate decision-making authority for things that you, as in your own language, have no tool to solve. But I do think that's dangerous because part of what you're trying to do is confine ICANN to being its one particular point in the ecosystem. But I do recognize the logic of saying, well, this organization has figured out a revenue model that gives it resources to support the overall evolution of the ecosystem broadly. And so we are going to spend money in areas outside our remit because it helps everybody get along, it helps governments learn, helps people participate, and so forth. But I do think it is fundamentally intention to be broadening beyond your core horizons at the same time that you're trying to isolate a role with a broader ecosystem which is non-governmental.
Gordon, do you see a way forward here?
Very well said. Well, first of all, let me applaud this analysis of the fundamental geopolitical tensions around the internet. I think that's exactly spot on. And in Busan, there was something surreal about being in a room with all these member states where Russia was speaking and applauding, embracing the values of the internet, and Iran and China and so forth, and realizing that there was a fundamental disconnection from the core geopolitical interests that they are really focused on, which makes me very nervous about the ITU's effort to capture more and more of this emerging agenda related to the internet. But a question for you, Fadi, in a more immediate and time-limited context, which is this. When the Commerce Department announced last March that they would devolve their legal oversight of its relationship with ICANN, Larry Strickling from Commerce articulated these conditions, which you alluded to in your remarks, that no foreign government could have oversight over ICANN, no international institution or international organization, including but not limited to the ITU, could exercise that role, and that critically important that whatever oversight mechanism did exist or would evolve could ensure the reliability, the stability, and the resilience of the global internet. So, the question for you, Fadi, when you testified before Congress last March, before the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee, you encountered some pretty aggressive Republican criticism and opposition to this transition.
Yes.
Since then, our already dysfunctional political environment in Washington has gone completely toxic, and we are now looking at 2 years of real gridlock and great partisanship. How concerned are you, Fadi, about the political environment in Washington and how it will impinge upon the timeline for the so-called ICANN transition? Are you worried that you may encounter roadblocks in this administration's relationship with a now Republican-controlled Congress that ultimately is going to weigh in on what you hope to achieve?
I'm not worried. First, because I think ultimately Republicans want less government involved. So they have, I think, at the end of the day, to embrace their own values, which are less government and let private sector prevail. So, frankly, we're all stunned that Republicans are not embracing the decision of this administration that we have less government control of the internet. Where the issue started becoming problematic is when people conflated the decision of the US government to relinquish this contract they have with me on a very small part of what we do, by the way, with the US is giving up control of the internet. And as I said before, jokingly, the US doesn't control the internet. No one controls the internet. That is why it's called the internet. And that's the internet we all want. I think the false idea that by relinquishing this contract, the US government will lose control of the internet is really something pushed by people who have other agendas. Now, at the end of the day, what is important for us is that the President and his cabinet remain firmly committed to this transition. It's very important. And that is evidenced by Secretary Pritzker, the head of the Commerce Department of the United States government, showed up personally for the first time in ICANN's history to ICANN's meeting a few weeks ago in Los Angeles to actually commit and recommit the US government to complete this transition so long as the conditions they laid out are met. Right? So this was kind of a carrot and stick. It's very clear we're still committed to let you go independent without the training wheels, but you need to meet our conditions. The community is responding very well to the message of Secretary Pritzker, and a proposal is coming together. We estimate that this proposal will be delivered to the US government sometime between March and June of this coming year, so that we are on track. Will there be opposition from Congress? I think there will be. Will you see me in front of Congress for hearings? Most likely, yes. Am I worried? I'm respectful of the process, and we need to participate in it. But I'm not worried, because I do believe that calm and wisdom will prevail. It is in the interest of the United States that the internet remains open for ideas and for business. And the best way to guarantee that is to tell all governments, including ours, that it's better we don't have any unique control of the internet. If we are telling all these governments, stand back, let's give the internet its space, participate as an equal stakeholder, and then we tell them, oh, and by the way, sorry, on ICANN we have a unique role. It doesn't add up. It makes our arguments hollow. Mm-hmm. And so let's live by our own values, and let's invite our fellow Republicans to live by their own values of less government. Having said that, nothing should replace the role of the US government that jeopardizes the stability and security of the system. So I am agreeing with Republican voices and other reasonable voices that are saying
let's make sure ICANN is not capturable. We don't want ICANN to be capturable by some other body. So let's strengthen our accountability. We're about to launch a major accountability track, and we have global experts from all over the world. And thankfully, Mr. Ira Magaziner, who was in the White House and was, as you know, was very involved in the creation of much of this, hopefully will be joining us. We're courting him, and we want others from around the world, from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, to join us in how to strengthen ICANN's governance and accountability mechanisms to ensure we're not a capturable organization. We believe right now we're not capturable, but we want to put belt and suspenders on this so that we can assure the world, not just the American public, that as the US removes these training wheels, that bike is going to go straight up.
Well, thank you very much. I think this has given us a great deal to think about. We are already at time, but we can't leave without a few questions. If we could indulge for another couple of moments, and just if anyone has a burning, would like to make a question, please come up to the mic. Do I see any? I'm not. Yes. Please.
I was hoping that someone else would ask this, but it seems like the fundamental issue, Fadi, is that the model you're proposing at the ITU and is this non-governmental approach, from the perspective of governments, effectively has no precedent. And if it does have a precedent, what is the precedent? Because it sounds, and this is a good question for a School of International and Public Affairs to discuss, but what is the prospect that governments would essentially accept a regime that is non-governmental? I mean, I find that there's a real logical challenge there.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Let me first clarify, we are not proposing a non-governmental model. We are proposing a model where governments are keenly involved and engaged, but where the room is not only made up of governments. So, in fact, I would go as far as saying that if governments are not engaged, we have a problem. We have an issue. Governments have a public responsibility to their citizens. We may argue about one government versus the other, and it's true, they're not all, let's say, equally committed to their public interest, but it's not for us to judge. If it's a government in place, it's a government that has power to legislate and to affect the lives of their citizens. They must be at the table. Now let me go to the heart of your question, because what you're asking is, why would government cede any control? The reality is, if you have control, even if you have control over small things, your family, your car, you don't give up control easy. Nobody gives up control easy. I met a vice president of a pretty major Latin American country who said to me, Fadi, listen, the internet is powerful. We governments like power. We're not going to let go of it. Get this straight, right? He was the straight shooter. He was telling me exactly what he's thinking. And my answer to him was, listen, we need you engaged. We're not asking you to give up all the control. They have to have some control. But we don't have frameworks for this. And today, the only frameworks where governments, as we were discussing earlier, Dean Janow, governments are used to a framework and a model by which they sit down, they put their flag, they discuss things, and there is an order to this. But that order, as I told you earlier, is deeply challenged by the internet. They're also starting to realize that the order and the framework they know is simply no longer adequate. It's a 19th century, 20th century model that is simply failing the 21st century realities of how to govern the internet. What is making it fail is two things. The speed of the internet. Remember that Attorney General saying, I shut it off in my country, it opened in an hour somewhere else. I shut it off in that other country, it opened in an hour else. The speed of this medium is challenging everyone. And then the second thing that challenges everyone is not just its speed and how fast it morphs and moves, it's also the fact that it's truly borderless in every sense of the word. Right? So air is borderless, but it's not fast. You pollute in New York, it takes it a while to get to Oklahoma City. You pollute the internet in South Africa before you blink, it's in front of your children in LA. So the speed and morphing technology of the internet, coupled with its borderless nature, is what's challenging everyone. I don't know the answers, David, but I think the answer to your question is that governments, outside of the microphones and the limelight, if you sit down with most governments, and I want to mention one in particular, they will tell you at the end of the day that they are challenged. That if we all governments sat down in a room and decided who's going to track whom on what website, we still need the technical folks to be in the room, because the technical folks are the people who have to agree to this and end up implementing it in browsers. Governments can't do it. So they need the technical folks, they need civil society folks to understand nuances of what they're deciding. They need everybody in the room. This is difficult. Now, you also, I'll mention the one government, I didn't forget, but you asked, where is this working? Give me a reference model, Fadi. I also will invite Dean Janow to help me with this, but at least at ICANN, good or bad, you can argue every possible way, it's working. Okay? The bike is not perfect, it needs tuning, and yes, but it's working. Tell me which other private organization at every meeting has nearly 150 governments showing up advising me. Businesses, civil society, NGOs, users, they're all there. Our meetings are growing partly because of the growing remit, which you are right about, so we'll talk about this offline, you're right. But partly because people want to understand how to participate in this. Our last meeting had 3,000 to 4,000 people. It's remarkable how many people want to come and participate in the process. Well, the one government, it is China I wanted to mention to you, David. Look at China. It's fascinating how China is engaging in this debate. China, for a while, simply talked about the great Chinese internet, 600 million users. We're big. And that was the only thing you heard from the Chinese government. They reminded you every time you met them how big China's internet is. Right? Now China's message is completely different. I just arrived from Wuzhen near Shanghai, where the Chinese government held its first World Internet Conference. The premier was there. He met us. We met Jack Ma. We met many CEOs of US companies, LinkedIn, Thomson Reuters. We were all there. And what was the message China was giving? Remarkable. They said, actually, we want to be part of the global internet. That's a very big shift in China's. We're not the big internet. No, we are part of the global internet. Premier Li said, multi-stakeholder, one internet for one world. It's remarkable. We never heard these words from China before. And we need to understand them. But what that means, in conclusion, David, is that China, like any other government, who is willing to come to our institutions and work with us on one internet for the world, also wants its seat at the table. We cannot keep saying the Western world is running the internet or the US is running ICANN and then tell them, hey, come to our one world, one internet. No, we're willing to come, but give us a seat at the table.
Thank you very much. This has been a tremendous conversation, just the beginning, obviously hugely complex. And I thank you very much for being with us today. Please join me in thanking Fadi and our distinguished guests.